Each of the following are lacking a real solution. Why? Hint, consider the graphs of the parent function. Now, I'm going to go and look at the graphs here in a little bit. Before I do that, I'm going to actually use the hand trick and guide us through this. Now remember on the hand trick, whenever you see an inverse function like sine inverse here, what you're going to do is not be looking at the palm of your left hand, but you'll be looking at the back of your left hand. Now we know the relationship psi y cos x, tangent is y over x. So sine is representative of y over h. If it's an inverse, that means that -2 represents y over h. I have no h here, so for a second I'm going to make this a fraction, and I have it written this way. Our values h are always total fingers. The y are the fingers above the bend. So this means I need to have, and when I need to first change this to a square root. So right now, if I want to change it, I would ask myself, what square roots would these come from? Well, it would be negative square root of 4 over square root 1. But h needs to be the total fingers, and our total fingers, we've learned, always needs to be 4. So I'd multiply by top and bottom by square root of 4. This would help me get my values. Now, unsimplified, this would mean I'm looking for negative square root of 16 over square root 4. And something has happened here. Okay, negative square root of 16 over square root 4. So here's the problem. As we look at our back of our hand, I need 4 total fingers, and I need 16 of them to be above the break. Well, this is impossible. So from here, we could find out that this does not exist just from using the hand trick. Now, let me show you why it does not exist. We're going to go to sine inverse here in our calculators. So I'm going to look at the graph like the hint told me to. And when I type in sine inverse, and I put in the x here, I know the value was -2. We'll check that in a second. There's the inverse graph. Now we've learned that it cuts off because what this would do is it comes from the sine curve, which is a wave. Let me just add that in real quick. Whoops, sorry. Sine x. It comes from a wave. Now that is the original, and you know in inverse we switch x and y. So instead of it being a wave on the x-axis, it should be a wave on the y. Well, why does this one not continue on is for a very simple reason, and that is it would not pass the vertical line test. So now let me take this one away so we're not confused. So this is the only part of the sine inverse function that exists. Notice the domain exists from -1 to +1. That's all it extends. We were supposed to find sine inverse of -2 there. Now that doesn't work because it's outside the domain. That's why it doesn't exist. Another way of doing this is if I press Control T to pull up a table, I can look and you can see only the values between -1 and 1 produce any type of values. All of these are undefined, so that's why it does not exist at that spot. Now let's try the next answer, or the next question. Now depending on the time of the printing, you might have seen this problem, or it actually might have said cotangent of pi. That's what it should be. This was a typo, but let me just go through how we'd find it, and this is actually a good value. Now I'm going to use, this is a normal tangent, so I'm looking at the palm of my hand. Pi does not have a denominator, so that represents the pinky. Think about pi being 180, so it's the pinky. You'd bend your pinky, and then you flip your hand over. Now tangent is a relationship y over x. Y is the square root of the fingers above the bend. We'll have 0 fingers up there. So this, I'm going to erase this for the time being. This would mean that I have 0 over, and now how many fingers do you have below the pinky bend? I have 4. So it'd be 0 over square root 4. 0 divided by anything is 0. So this one does exist, and the value is 0. Now, if you got if you printed yours after I did the update, your problem looks like cotangent of pi. That's what the problem should have been. So let's check that one. Again, where does pi fall in the hand trick? Well, it's your pinky. So I bend the pinky, and I flip my hand over. And cotangent, psi y cos x, tangent is y over x. If tangent's y over x, cotangent is x over y. So in this case, I have the square root of 4. The x's are on the bottom of the hand. I have 4 of those fingers, so it'd be square root 4 over y, which is 0. This is undefined. Why is it undefined? Because you're dividing by 0. So this problem, we said it does not exist, or you could say it's undefined, because it was outside the domain. That's why. So the reasoning here is outside of domain. Okay, that's the reason why this one does not exist. This one does not exist because you're dividing by 0. So for two different reasons, those are undefined. Now let's try secant. If you think about secant, secant is like, I would say sexy is cozy and cozy is sexy. This is secant, kind of like sexy. It goes with cosine. Now cosine's x over h. So secant will be the relationship h over x. Okay, now this is the back of the hand. So this is saying you have 0 fingers, which means 0 needs to be on top. And if we have 0 on top, we got a problem because we're saying the hypotenuse is 0. We don't know what the denominator is. It would be something other than 0 because, again, you're not allowed to divide by 0. But you're still saying the hypotenuse is 0. That's problematic. So this one's also undefined. To help us out, we're going to look at the graph here. So I'll pull this up. I'm going to take away the table. And now let's look at these functions here. Let me come up. Sorry, my calculator's going crazy. And I'm going to go to my first function that we had. I'm going to change this to secant. So go to trig, secant inverse, and I'm going to put an x. And graph. And so it's trying to show me secant. As I look at this graph, again I see that this is outside the domain. The domain does not exist at 0. When I press Control T, you can see that at 0, my graph is undefined as well. I'm sorry my calculator's having these troubles, but it's also undefined. And this domain extends from negative infinity to negative 1 and then picks back up from 1 to positive infinity. So that's why that one does not exist. So this would be the same reasoning as the first one, does not exist outside a domain. And finally, we come to this one. Here, cosine inverse square root of 7 over 2. Now, if you think about it, here's what this is saying. Cosine, psi y, cos x, tangent is y over x. This is x over h. And we are saying the x is square root of 7, the h is 2. Well, where does the value 2 come from? Like what square root? Answer, it would be the square root of 7 over the square root of 4. Now let's just think about this practically for a second. If you were going to try to draw this triangle, you'd have the x value, which we know is the square root of 7. We don't know what the y value would be, so I'm just going to draw a dotted line real quick to represent the y. We don't know how long that would be, but then we do know the length of the h. It's a square root of 4. So if that's a square root of 7 here, then this needs to be the square root of 4. Do you see the problem? We can't make a complete triangle. Why? Because the h is not the longest side. So this is an impossible triangle. Again, it does not exist because you cannot have something greater. This is greater than 1. It's going to be outside the domain. So again, this one does not exist because it's outside the domain. We could look at the graph and you'll see that just like the sine functions or sine inverse was only between negative 1 and 1, so also the cosine inverse would only exist between negative 1 and 1. The square root of 7 is greater than 2. Think about 2 squared is 4. This is going to be closer to the value of 3. It's going to be 2 point something. And so that's why this one does not exist as well. So the whole key to these, understanding why they exist or why they don't, is thinking about, is it because it's an impossible triangle? Is one of the legs longer than the hypotenuse? Or is it just because we're not allowed to divide by 0, something of that nature? So that's kind of what you're looking for on these problems.